Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fifth and final episode of Art Up Close at the BCMA. Thank you for being here. My name is Claire, and I am a senior studying art history and economics, and I'm a member of the Student Advisory Council for the museum. And I'm
Lucy.
And so this webinar, for those of you who have joined us before or haven't before, this webinar is aimed at connecting students with specific pieces of art in the museum's collections. Each episode features a bite-sized presentation led by a Bowdoin student, an art history professor, or a member of the museum staff. We hope that you learned something new today, and we encourage you to ask questions after the chat after Lucy's presentation. Our other 4 episodes are available on Bowdoin's YouTube channel, and I will drop the link in the group chat for you to check them out. Today, we are so excited to welcome Bowdoin Junior Lucy Siegel to speak about the BCMA's Assyrian reliefs and the question of repatriation. So I'll quickly introduce Lucy. Lucy is a junior at Bowdoin. She's studying art history and government with a concentration in international relations. Lucy is from Katona, New York, and she's loved museums and art ever since she was young. Lucy is a member of the Bowdoin Art Society. She's a peer editor for the Bowdoin Journal of Art, and she's my co-Bowdoin Student Government representative for the Museum Advisory Council. Lucy interned over the summer at the Center for Art Law in Brooklyn, New York, and she hopes to practice art law one day. This experience launched her interests in questions surrounding repatriation, which Lucy will be discussing with us today. We encourage all of you to engage with Lucy and ask any questions you can think of after her presentation. I'll be moderating a Q&A session. And closed captioning is available on the bottom toolbar of your screen. So with that, I will turn it over to Lucy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. So I'm first just going to share my screen so that everyone can see what we're going to be looking at. I'm really excited to be here and to be talking about this. This is our final broadcast of the semester. So I've just been really lucky to get to do this with Claire and have this experience this semester. So with that, I would first like to start off by, again, thanking everyone who helped me research this topic or just picked my brain and talked through all of my ideas with me. Big shout out specifically to Art Society for giving me a place to present and then work through my presentations with me before giving it to you all today. So yes, I will be talking about the Assyrian reliefs in Bowdoin College's Museum of Art. And these reliefs are the iconic slabs featured in the ongoing Assyria to America exhibit. And I'm so excited to talk about them because they're a really great case study for how complicated repatriation actually is. So repatriation means the return of something to its own country. And throughout my time at Bowdoin, I've heard calls to repatriate the reliefs. But what does that actually mean? This webinar and this conversation is aimed at discussing the complexities related to these reliefs and how repatriation as a concept is never just straightforward. So this is a hypothetical conversation. That's a really important piece to understand because there's no ongoing efforts to repatriate these reliefs. But I just wanted to unpack the nuances of repatriation and thought the best way to do this for the Bowdoin student body would be through these famed reliefs and through the reliefs that are very recognizable to many students on campus. So with that, I would first like to start off with a brief history of the relics. And I will also put in the chat at the end links to the exhibit on this website. So this will not necessarily be a visual analysis of the exhibit, but more questions surrounding the existence. So first, the images of these reliefs in the presentation, including the ones above, are from the Bowdoin Museum of Art's catalogs for Assyria to America exhibit and the Assyrian bas-reliefs catalog. So first, these reliefs are over 2,500 years old. They're originally part of the palaces and temples of Sir Narisbal II. He was the ruler of the Empire of Assyria. And the ancient capital, home to the palace, was known as Kalu and is now near the modern city of Nimrod. So Kalu was destroyed in 1612 BC by Assyrian enemies, and for many generations, it just lay in ruins. But it was one of the first cities rediscovered in the 19th century, And this city really captured the imagination of European and American art collectors, historians, and became a destination for archaeologists. So there were a lot of archaeologists from Europe and from the United States in this area starting in the mid 19th century when it was first discovered. So these reliefs stood in northern Iraq for thousands of years. But according to Bowdoin's Assyria bas reliefs catalog, in 1845, English diplomat Austin Henry Layard snuck into the site at night. He knew that local Turkish authorities or Ottoman authorities at the time would forbid him from looting the site and looting the reliefs, so he went under the cover of darkness. He excavated mini reliefs that would end up all over the world, including at Middlebury College, Hamilton College, Williams College, and Bowdoin College, and other similar institutions. So a group of American missionaries were working in the area, approached the diplomat and asked him if they could send reliefs to their home institutions. One of these missionaries was Dr. Henry Byron Haskell, a Bowdoin alumnus. He wrote the college asking if we would be interested in the carvings. The college said yes and paid the price of the shipping the reliefs to Brunswick from Iraq. So that was about $728 then, roughly $25,000 now. Seems like a pretty expensive shipping fee, but for context, a similar relief to the ones we have 5 of them, sold at auction for $31 million in 2018. And again, the image above shows the excavation site. So the controversial aspect of these reliefs isn't just the way we acquired them or kind of this gray area about how we acquired them. The reliefs are also pieces of cultural heritage, also known as cultural property. UNESCO defines cultural heritage as the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group of or society that are inherited from past generations, maintained in the present, and bestowed for the benefit of future generations. So the Assyrian reliefs in the museum are pieces of cultural property, of Iraqi cultural property, or cultural heritage, of Assyrian cultural heritage, and I myself have questioned the legitimacy of having objects that are so obviously culturally important to a different region of the world in Brunswick, Maine. Yet cultural heritage is not just limited to one place, and the reliefs contribute to the cultural heritage of Brunswick and the Bowdoin campus as well. In fact, you can see these reliefs by just driving past campus on Main Street through these large street-facing windows as seen in the image above. And actually where I lived my sophomore year, I could see these reliefs from my bedroom. So they do have an impact on the campus and have some cultural significance for the community at Bowdoin as well. And this is where the complications begin. So I want to turn to our hypothetical scenario now that you have a bit of background. If the museum were to attempt repatriation efforts, where would it begin? I first want to talk about some of the reasons I've heard on campus or in the classrooms why these reliefs should be repatriated, no matter the complexities. So some suggest, some suggest that there is an ethically gray area on how these reliefs were acquired and how we obtained a very valuable cultural property for very little money, relatively. But there's also the consideration of the implications of colonialism in America as an imperial power. The fact that these exist in Brunswick is connected to the recent American role as a colonizer instead of a colony. This is a similar circumstance to one of the most well-known repatriation conversations concerning the Greek Elgin marbles in the British Museum. So along this line of thinking, it has been suggested that since we do not have a department dedicated to Middle Eastern studies, we cannot accurately contextualize these objects because we lack an understanding of their historical and contemporary implications and also don't have the tools to then do that work. So then that's just another example. And finally, the final argument and the one I'm most intrigued by for reasons for repatriating these objects, no matter what, is that these objects would not be here if they are retained the exact same way today. In response to the connection between antiquities trafficking and terrorist financing, we have multiple bilateral agreements with Iraq that protect cultural property, specifically Iraqi cultural property, and would have made it impossible for these reliefs to enter the United States legally if they were to be entered the States today. So with these reasons to support repatriation, there are also claims about why these reliefs specifically should not be repatriated. And the most common claim is that these reliefs would be destroyed if they were sent back to Iraq. In 2015, ISIS destroyed the original site of these reliefs, the palace at Nimrud, after designating it as shirk. Shirk, the Arabic word for symbols representing polytheism and idolatry, are commonly destroyed by ISIS groups. It's a way that they finance their terrorist operations, as I mentioned. So some claim that if the museum were to undertake repatriation efforts, they would just be sending the reliefs to their doom, suggesting they would be destroyed by terrorist groups once in Iraq. So it is sadly true that we cannot repatriate the reliefs back to their original location. Therefore, we must ask, if not there, then where would we give the reliefs back to? If we can't put them back where they are because it is in an ISIS-controlled area, has been destroyed by ISIS, where would they go? So the most obvious answer, I believe, to this question would be to give the reliefs to the Iraqi government, repatriate them to the Iraqi government. Yet, according to the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, the largest Assyrian communities are found in Australia, Germany, Sweden, and the United States. This is because of a major diaspora in the 1920s in response to Assyrian genocide by Ottoman troops. Therefore, Assyrian people are dispersed across the world, from their original home in northern Iraq to, yes, Brunswick, Maine. So the Iraqi government is not necessarily the right answer because they don't represent the Assyrian population necessarily any more than the United States government does. Yet these reliefs could still be in a cultural museum, somewhere there is a higher concentration of people of Assyrian descent besides Brunswick, but Assyrian people are so dispersed that anywhere they would be accessible to, anywhere do we put these reliefs, they just would not be accessible to the entire population. Thus, the complications still yield no answer. Finally, I've heard many students suggest that we should sell these reliefs and dedicate the money to financial aid or to founding a Middle Eastern Studies department so we could appropriately contextualize at least what we had. While this is a great idea and concept, this suggestion ignores the rules and regulations the BCMA is under as a museum, which cannot just deaccession parts of its collection at whim and do whatever it pleases with the money. These reliefs may be incredibly valuable culturally, but cultural property does not have intrinsic monetary value that can be so easily exchanged. So, in conclusion, there's no clear way to repatriate these reliefs. I have no clear opinion on this. I don't know if I gave you one, but hopefully I at least explored why this is not a straightforward question. But this doesn't mean we should just throw our hands in the air and give up. These reliefs, for better or worse, are at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. It is therefore our responsibility to contextualize them accurately, listen to their story of where they come from and how they got here, and have these types of honest conversations about what repatriation would actually look like. So in closing, I would like to really thank the Bowdoin Museum of Art for being bold and brave enough to have this conversation and give me a platform to have this conversation where I just essentially question the legitimacy of a central piece of their collection. And this is something I don't think every museum would have the courage to do. And I just feel honored to be a part of the Bowdoin Museum in any way. And I'm proud that they've done this and given me this space. But like I said, these conversations are essential. It is now up to our peer institutions, Middlebury, Williams, Hamilton, who have these reliefs as well, to also have these discussions. So I pass the torch to you. And with that, thank you for listening and for thinking about this complicated question. I am happy to try to answer any questions you have, or at least refer you to maybe some more resources that at least have some legal authority to be telling you the answers. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucy. This was a very interesting presentation, a challenging topic, and we all applaud you for your work in opening up this discussion. So with that, we open it up to Q&A. You can type your answers in the chat or the Q&A boxes on the bottom toolbar. And while you're thinking of your questions, I can kind of kick it off. Lucy, do you know what the repatriation laws at the time that these reliefs were taken, what they were?
Definitely. So, well, definitely is not the right answer. Basically, it's complicated. These reliefs were taken in 1845. This area of Iraq was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire would stay in control until World War I or the end of World War I. And there's no repatriation laws for the Ottoman Empire. The Turkish government has their own patrimony laws of Turkish property, which some people in Turkey may say extend to these reliefs. But then that gets into the question of what are Iraqi repatriation laws concerning artifacts from 1845. So there's definitely more competing legal definitions, case law to go off of for like what the actual repatriation laws 150 years ago would have been, or 170 years ago would have been. But repatriation as a concept is relatively new. This idea of patrimony laws and of nationalizing cultural property is relatively new. And the way that Iraq actually protects their cultural property isn't necessarily through these laws, but through bilateral agreements with the United States, specifically after lootings in 2003 in Baghdad, and just pretty high profile instances where the United States then stepped in and acted as a protector of Iraqi cultural property, but really because of its connection to terrorist looting. So that is a long way of saying that there are no clear repatriation laws from 150 years ago that would govern these reliefs. There is no clear law on the books that says we have to give these reliefs back, because international law doesn't necessarily have that the way of necessarily implementing its laws, and there's no clear national laws or domestic laws in Iraq or in Turkey as well, which is just an interesting conversation about colonialism as well, because that's still an element of the conversation.
Thank you for sharing. Interesting. So we have some questions popping up and we're going to answer these live. The first is a great presentation. This provokes the question of sometimes conflicting roles of government, which is temporary and transient, versus culture, which is historic and slowly evolving. Can you think of any instances when culture and government were so aligned to make a case that any artifacts should be repatriated to government?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So just thinking about what I was just talking about, how in response to specifically the destruction of two Buddhas in Iraq, in Baghdad, I want to say, and then also in Mosul, just complete destruction in Syria of looting of their museums in the early 2000s, that actually got a lot of people, really, a lot of Americans very upset about the destruction of cultural property by ISIS, or not ISIS at the time, but by similar terrorist organizations, that there was such a push for like cultural property protections and repatriation efforts that the American government actually started taking pretty serious steps to repatriate things that were looted. And specifically the Hobby Lobby case, which is, I think it just ended, but it might still be on appeal. Essentially, the CEO of the craft store chain, mega craft store chain, obtained a bunch of antiquities from Iraq that had shady provenance, which is the record of everyone who's owned it, has shady backstory, not necessarily clear where they were from, for his Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. And it became apparent after there were like obvious connections between the looting of the Baghdad Museum, which is where these artifacts were actually from, and terrorist financing, that it became obvious these purchases for the Museum of the Bible actually did directly sponsor terrorism. And this was such an affront to American, I mean, this was at like a time where we were very much involved in the war on terror. This was such an affront to American ideas of just terrorists as the enemy and just protection of like culture and property, that the United States actually repatriated almost everything to Iraq, which is really interesting because it's not necessarily clear, except in this case, it was obvious that the leader of the Hobby Lobby group had, or the man who wanted to make the, I forget his name, who wanted to make the museum, had obtained these, had known that they were shady provenance, has known that he was not obtaining them legally. So because he'd known about that, that implicated him. And then also because there was an obvious place to give them back to. We obviously should give them to the museum that they were looted from 2 years before, during a civil war, or during the unrest in Baghdad. So I think that kind of answers your question, is that when all the factors align perfectly and it's not super complicated like it is with the reliefs, there's more obvious who took it, where should it go, the United States responds. The United States responds because America as a culture does not approve the destruction of cultural property, of priceless artifacts. So yeah, interesting question. I hope that answers it kind of.
Interesting response. Well done. So we have two questions that are kind of similar, and they are about the museum's collection themselves. So are there any objects in the Bowdoin Museum that have been repatriated or considered for repatriation? And then are there any that you think should be considered for repatriation? And both of these comments say, great job too.
Thank you. So in my knowledge, I do not know of anything in the Bowdoin Museum that has been repatriated, or I guess there have been efforts to repatriate it. There may have been in the past that just are gone, and I don't know about them. But in my conversations I have not with people who work at the museum, nothing has come up. With that said, there are definitely so many artifacts that have complicated stories at every museum that I am sure there are things in the Bowdoin Museum that I wouldn't necessarily point to and say that should be repatriated tomorrow, but I could say we could have a conversation like this. We could have a really complicated discussion. We go in circles and I don't give a clear answer because this is a complicated conversation. It's not like restitution. Restitution cases refer to cases, typically Nazi looted art, where they were stolen when they sent the Jewish art gallerists to a concentration camp, and then those paintings that they stole are restituted to the descendants who survived. Really famous examples is An Egg on Chile, Woman in Gold. If anyone's seen, I think Ryan Reynolds or Ryan Gosling's in it. This is that is a much more obvious, clear cut. The Nazis stole it, killed the person who took it. We should give it to their descendants. Case. So yeah, I don't know if there's any restitution cases like that in the museum. But my basic answer is I don't know, but I'm sure there are things that we can talk about like this.
Great. Right now we have one more in the chat if you're willing to answer.
Yeah.
This one is asks, are there any repatriation laws in international law or in certain countries that apply to groups without official governments? Assyrians, indigenous groups, etc. What would repatriation to that kind of dispossessed community look like?
That's such an interesting question. So basically, no, for groups of like refugee populations, that's kind of why there are so many bilateral agreements with Syria, even though we don't necessarily have any other type of relationship with Syria right now. Protecting Syrian property is because it's very difficult for populations that don't either have a strong, stable government or have no government at all, that are borderless, that don't have, like, basically this question of the Assyrian population, that are dispersed. So there's no, they're not able to have a bilateral agreement with the United States State Department. There's no, they're not able to, nationalizing cultural property means, or property or patrimony laws means, like Greece has patrimony laws. Every item or every antiquity from Greece from before a certain year is Greek national property. If it's sold at auction, Greek can go and say that's ours, or Greece can go and say that's ours. The Assyrian people obviously have no way of doing that. There's no formal government to do that for them. This is where groups like UNESCO come in, international intergovernmental organizations that are supposed to regulate the international exchange when countries aren't stepping up themselves to do it. So in theory, UNESCO would apply, and the UNESCO Convention in 1970 would apply. But that was 50 years ago. And I think that the changing nature of migrant populations, of refugee populations, and just the fact that our world does not look like Assyrian people are only in North Iraq and there are no Assyrian people in Brunswick, it's not that clear cut anymore. So yeah, I guess the answer is that there is no clear way to repatriate to dispersed groups, but there are international laws that at least attempt to, that I do think need to be at least updated for the contemporary situation.
Thank you for sharing. So I know we said one more, but we do have one more, and this provides a little information about the museum too, which I think will be helpful, and you can keep your answer as brief or long as you like.
Yes.
So this comment reads, Lucy, thank you for sharing your thoughts. As you may know, the museum currently has an exhibition on view right now focused on the ancient and modern histories of these reliefs. Student research plays an important role in this show. Additionally, the museum has recently co-launched in the spring of 2019 with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a collaborative project bringing together approximately a dozen museums in the northeastern United States to study reliefs held in their collection. There is a significant degree of expertise represented in this group. What recommendations do you have for further involving students both in work related to these reliefs and in learning more about the complex issues related to management of cultural heritage?
That's a really great question, because so actually I'm going to send at the very end of this presentation, I'm just going to send in the chat a couple links to just places that, like I said, there is a lot to unpack here, and I am in the beginning of my exploration of this. So there's a lot of things I don't know, and I will definitely link to that. And one of the things I'm linking to is the MET project. So that's a really great point. And I do think that the student body's response to these reliefs as something that are questionable, our ownership is questionable, I do think is because it's a student body. The student body doesn't necessarily feel like they have the tools to contextualize. So I think a class dedicated to these reliefs, the way that like our history classes are often dedicated to an exhibit, or like planning an exhibit, I think would just be a great way to increase student engagement, and give students also like a way to just, who are interested in it, really understand the complexities. I'm trying to make sure I'm answering this full question. Yeah, I do think that giving students, like, Bowdoin is an academic institution. Every single student here wants to learn, and we want to learn about these reliefs. We don't just want to learn about them as an art exhibit. We also want to learn about, like, what does it mean to have cultural diplomacy? Like, I do think there could be a gov class on these reliefs. I think that there could be a history class. I think the nature of Bowdoin and the nature of the liberal arts education gives us so many different ways to think about these, that I think just like the student body would really appreciate an opportunity to just think about these, not just as art pieces and not just within the context of the Bowdoin Art Museum, but within the context of other things we're learning about on campus. So yeah, I think they're really such a fascinating piece. Again, I am incredibly impressed with the museum's desire to have these conversations and to have like these very open conversations, because like I said, it's complicated and there's a lot of emotions surrounding it. So I think with that, I thank you all. I really enjoyed talking about this, thinking about this. Everyone asked such great questions. I really appreciate the way that your questions also made me think about this. I've done this presentation multiple times for different people, and every time we talk about it, at the end, someone says something different and someone says something else that makes me think. So I really think the only way we can like contextualize and give these reliefs the respect they deserve is to have these conversations and to keep thinking and to keep talking, and to not just say these should be repatriated, period. These should not be repatriated, period. Understand why there's no straight answer or straightforward answer. So yeah, I am going to send right now. And also if anyone wants any more information, I'll also send my email into the chat, but so this is in the chat right now. I'm just gonna send, actually, yeah, I will send my email in the chat. And if anyone wants any more information, please feel free to email me. I would love to share a link with you. And I will also share right now that link for the MET project. So it's a 12-minute, this is a link to a 12-minute video. It's phenomenal. It's so interesting. It's about destruction of cultural property in Iraq and Syria. Again, this is not just the protection of cultural heritage. This is a major way that specifically ISIS is funding itself. So this cultural property and the questions of it have so many implications. And I just, anyway, not the way that the Bowdoin Museum was looted, or not the way that the Bowdoin Museum pieces did not finance terrorism. But anyway, yeah, that's all I have for you all. Thank you so much. Claire, if you want to say anything.
Wonderful. I was just going to say thank you for shining light on this complex issue and really presenting multiple arguments for different sides. And I hope that everybody can quickly write down that information in the chat. I think it will disappear when this meeting ends. So thank you so much for joining us. And this was our last episode of this semester. So thank you for being with us for previous episodes as well. Thank you. Enjoy your Wednesday. Bye.